If you bather back to me too.
We've got a news update here. We've got preparing for tomorrow's guest, Tuomas Malinen, who is one of the only Finnish sensible guys out there. And those of us, my bookshelf is filled with the memoirs of people like Kekkonen. And his country was, he called it Czechoslovakia, not Czechoslovakia, but Kekkonen. And people, he was the sort of the landsfather, as they say in Sweden, the country, the paternal figure who ruled Finland for a very long time. He visited the KGB residency once a week, but he had friendly relations with the Russians, as Finns ought to do. Traded with the Russians, but kept Finland's democracy completely intact, and built Finland up to be one of the best welfare states in the world. And the Finns had a very strong sense of self-belief, I would say, as the Swedes did. I mean, we were talking just before the break. I'm working on an article on Folke Bernadotte, who agitated very strongly for the right of return for Palestinians already in 1948. And but Bernadotte was almost written out of Swedish history for decades, because he was pretty skeptical of Israel from what he saw just from 3 months there, and that's why the Israelis assassinated him. They thought that his position, as if his position remained, taking up his headquarters at the government house in Jerusalem and placing the UN, turning Jerusalem into a UN city, would have been disastrous for Israel. Anyway, you can say that Israelis might have done some bad things for many decades in Sweden, because the Israelis were a secular, labor-oriented socialist. The kibbutz mentality, I imagine, was quite strong. The very, very flat hierarchy. Everyone was in it together. There were no lords and no slaves, as it were. Everyone was an Israeli, and there's a strong ethnocentric. We're all Israelis. We're a little bit better than everyone else, and that was actually a kind of Swedish mentality too. Sweden was quite a well-armed country in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. Very, very Swedish, 98% white, and a very strong. Swedes didn't fight anyone, but there was a very strong sense of, we're better than everyone else. We don't have to tell you. And they had the third or fourth largest air force in the world, like 800 planes, which could take off from runways, which the motorways. You see a lot of roads in Sweden, country roads in Sweden, they're completely flat. That's because the planes were designed to take off there, so they didn't need air bases. And the Swedes were neutral. They didn't join NATO because they thought that we're too good for NATO. And then at the same time, they had an excellent reputation as a country that was, especially in developing countries, a country that didn't join NATO, had never had an imperial role, and had a social democrat welfare state. So the 50s and 60s, a lot of people look back to that period. I don't know Finland as well, but let's say 50s, 60s, 70s, Finland also had a very good reputation. And now, and they're very independent, and they're very realistic about their position in the world. Now the Finns seem to be accepting of a role of being the next sort of, cannon fodder to be fed into the machine to fight the Russians. And there's almost no opposition in the country. The youngish journalist corps in Helsinki are just shaking their fists and agitating against the Russians, and they're right on the border with that. Even though the Finnish economy has collapsed, because just as after the Soviet Union economy collapsed, they had a huge economic crisis, because if you went to Russia, Soviet Union in the 80s, everything was run by the Finns. Everything that worked was run by the Finns, like the Stockmann supermarket and the hotels. And then they lost that. And now, incidentally, they did very well out of the Tsarist Empire. I mean, Russians couldn't freely move into the Grand Duchy of Finland. They still spoke Swedish in Finland. They still had a democracy. And then there was some Russification towards the end. But for quite a long time, Finland did very well out of being part of the Russian Empire. They got a lot of good free trade benefits, arguably better than having been part of Sweden, which very, very few Swedes will admit, and the Finns were able to develop their national language. If it hadn't been for the Russians, they would still be speaking Swedish. It's probably true. They don't want to say that. Anyway, Now the Finns and the Swedes similar, but even less extreme. So I'm going to be talking to Thomas Malin about that tomorrow, and I'm wondering why in Europe, because the guest that you'll be watching from our previous show, it'll come up just before this show goes out, talked about the sort of pseudo democracy we've got all over Europe. And the guy who really stands for what people believe, Orbán, has just been on their way out. And now we've got this managerial pretend democracy that gets together whenever the popular will is in danger of upsetting the apple cart. So the AFD are never going to get into anywhere near power. They'll be banned if they do. And then they called Orbán a dictatorship, even though he's just conceded power. And then they called this Zelensky idiot, who's boasting about being a model for the rest of Europe. So we're being, here we're fighting against Russia, but we're being occupied by Ukraine mentally, psychologically, culturally, which is practically Russia anyway. We fighting Russian KGB, but the Ukrainian KGB is working hand in glove with MI6 to get us into war. And persuade us that Ukraine is like a fully fledged part of Europe, or should even be the sort of the capstone of the new Europe with its militarization, being a model for the rest of us. We didn't sign up for this. To be honest, most people think of Ukraine as over there. I mean, and I'm sorry to say, this East Europeanification of the EU is not what West Europeans really thought. They thought, well, we'll give the East Europeans a hand, but we're not going to become East Europeanized. But that's exactly what happened. We've taken on board their ancestral hatreds. And the Finns are kind of going along with this, even though they're the kind of most in danger of this. And as I said, I mean, we had this guy, Peter Magyar, coming in to office. Nobody, a non-entity, no policy positions, just some nice slogans that allows teenage and 20-something women, unmarried, childless, in bullshit administrative jobs to go and wave their flag on the main square in Budapest, have their little 1989 all over again. They don't know what he stands for, but he's handsome and he says, we want to be closer to Europe. Well, the funny thing is, Sanna Marin, the Finnish prime minister, very beautiful woman, very young. Her only previous job was working as a supermarket cashier, and then she became one of the European Union Young Leaders program, or whatever, the Soros, whatever it was, or the World Bank. She went through that mill, and so instead of having these wise old men who'd fought in wars as young men, and had been spent decades in the political machine before ascending to the premiership, where this young woman parachuting into the top job who brought Finland into NATO and into confrontation with Russia. So, I mean, I think there's two things. One is that we've got huge voting blocks of politically illiterate young people and young women. I mean, maybe it's not a coincidence that before 1908 or whatever, the franchise restricted to property-owning men over 30 or something, I'm sorry to say that. And then the other thing is this, almost like a factory in Brussels or somewhere. Moldova's got a youngish woman who's now anti-NATO, and they churn these people out, and people vote for them. And one country after the other with slightly independent inclinations ends up into this sort of pseudo-democratic society that we are developing in Europe. Martin, what are your thoughts?
I fully agree with you, Pelle. And from your inspired Demosthenes oration, two ideas and important ones occur to me. First, as I said on our previous show with the great George Samueli from on Hungary, there was a marvelous American science fiction writer called Philip K. Dick. He died in 1982, I believe. And almost nobody in Europe will remember him, but he made best-selling movies, or they were made either as he died or after he died. He came up with the idea for Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And
Blade Runner.
Yes, Blade Runner as well. So that was two. And he also came up with a couple of Steven Spielberg science fiction blockbusters starring Tom Cruise as well. So he had a huge cultural impact, and he was a genius. And in one of his classics, Time Out of Joint, if people should look up, may have a different titles in Europe or in Britain, but in America it's Time Out of Joint. He visualizes a world which is a thermonuclear waste after the European policies of confrontation with Russia have had their way and everything has been reduced to radioactive rubble. But the survivors are happy or think they're happy because they've been brainwashed, they've been hypnotized. All they need is little slips of paper that say, you are happy, or this is a movie theater, this is a McDonald's, this is a bar, this is a British pub. And they imagine it really is a pub. This is a nice, comfortable home with air conditioning and central heating and running water. And you're not living in a radioactive hovel. But as soon as the pieces of paper are removed, reality sets in. This is what you are describing in Europe today. There is no democracy in Europe. There are little bits of paper that say Viktor Orbán is a fascist. Bad. Peter Magyar is a Democrat. Good. The truly sinister Mr. Zelensky in Kiev, whose political opponents get shot or are in cars in Moscow that blow up, as a critical, wasn't even a Ukrainian exile, was a Russian journalist lady, the daughter of an eminent Russian opponent of the Ukraine regime, Alexander Dugin's daughter. He had a heartbreaking loss. She was assassinated by Ukrainian assassins in her car by a bomb in Moscow a few years ago. This is the kind of regime you're talking about. But no, and they've just suspended elections. Ukraine suspends elections. It's a democracy. The Romanian people want to elect an anti-Brussels nationalist. Their right to hold elections is stripped from them by cynical political movements. Macron comes from nowhere, and nobody in France likes him, but he runs France, and it's still a great democracy. It's the great home of democracy. But it's not. It's just a little piece of Philip K. Dick paper. Everybody in Britain despises Keir Starmer, has the lowest popularity, credibility ratings in British history. In British history, which goes back quite a long way, even if you just stick to the democratic era. But no, it's a democracy. Why? Because of Philip K. Dick. Because a little piece of paper is scribbled in Brussels, vote him in, vote her in. The other thought that struck me from what you said, Pelle, is Kekkonen. We need to revive the wisdom of President Kekkonen. We need, not just for Finland, but for all of Scandinavia and as a model for Europe. You have pointed out before how the once Protestant Christian societies of Northern Europe are not Protestant or Christian at all anymore. They're just as they are post-industrial, they are post-Christian, which means they're nothing at all. The great British Christian conservative writer G.K. Chesterton wrote 100 years ago, when people stop believing in God, by which he didn't mean any amorphous God. He meant very traditionally the Christian, or today we might say the Judeo-Christian God. Fine. Once they stop believing in that, they'll believe in anything. Muslim people around the world, to their credit, take Allah seriously. They take their faith seriously and with respect. I'm not trying to justify any of the extremist, hate-filled lunatics who slaughter innocent people, Muslim as well as Christian and Jewish around the world. Not that. Mainstream Islam is still vibrant. Mainstream Catholicism is actually very vibrant once you get outside Europe, especially in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So there is hope for civilization in the world. But in Europe, especially Northern Europe, everybody has lost their faith, has lost their industry at the same time, and they've gone soft in the head. And as a result, as you say, you have these young idiots coming up. They can be men, they can be women. They're pretty little boys, they're pretty little girls. They're not. Their brains are empty. We're in a Greta Thunberg world, and I say, what is the antidote to Greta Thunberg? How do we banish this ludicrous, destructive, naive, scientifically totally illiterate, ignorant idiot and her 30 or 80 or 100 million confreres around Europe. Let us revive the spirit of Ulu Kalava Kekkonen. Let us have a UKK society. What did, as you said, what did Kekkonen stand for? He stood for national pride, without war, without boasting. He stood for self-respect. He stood for constructive diplomacy with countries that you had reason to be fearful of or suspicious of. But if you treated them with respect and reality, they responded likewise. The Russians did not try and swallow up Finland whole. I would say we need a Kekkonen model rather than a Netanyahu model or a Zelensky model. Zelensky has led his society total annihilation and destruction. Netanyahu is doing that to Israel today. By contrast, Kekkonen gave Finland, as you pointed out and documented, the happiest, most prosperous, most secure period in its history. But not only does Finland need to revive the spirit of President Kekkonen, all of Scandinavia needs that. So let's you and I stand at the beginning of this peaceful, truly democratic, non-violent movement. Let us launch a Kekkonen movement, not just to reclaim peace and security and happiness for the people of Finland, but for the people of Norway and Sweden and Denmark and Iceland as well. Yay, Kekkonen.
Czechoslovakia. I mean, as I said, the interesting thing about Tuomas is that he's practically the only Finn who says that. And what can Finland teach the world? It can't teach the world to become the next piece of salami that's going to be sliced off by the relentless maw of war, but how to live next to a superpower. So he could. The Ukrainian, I mean, he says Ukraine should be Finlandized, and there are worse fates than being Finland in 1975. Believe me, I said it was a very highly prosperous democracy. I mean, I went to Finland in 1991, and the difference between Finland and the Soviet Union was enormous. And while Finland was a little bit poorer than Sweden, maybe, it was only a 5% difference. It was practically the same. Enormous difference between that and Estonia. So Finlandization had done very, very good things. And that's what the wise people, I think Niinistö, the Finnish president, was whispering something about the merits of Finlandization, that is, coexisting with Russia, being friends with Russia without yielding to them, as a model for Ukraine. And sometimes you've heard commentators saying Finlandization, but Finlandization took place 50 years ago, and people are young. People don't remember things from one generation to the next, so you have to be quite old to remember Finland as it was then. But that's Tuomas Manlinen. But what despairs him is young Finns don't know about Finlandization. They think that NATO is the only solution and that Russia's going to attack them yesterday. And as George was saying in our last show, the last Russians left Hungary in 1989. Hungary 1956, the crackdown was 70 years ago. And 15-year-old boys are going around saying, Russians out, Russians out. Well, there are no Russians in Budapest. If anything, there's Americans in Budapest, Why didn't they say Americans out? But they've been brainwashed. And I fear that what's happened in Finland is that, and Sweden, is that there's like half a dozen NATO-affiliated commentators who are very, very verbal. Often women have bullying in their genes. That's what they do when they're high school girls. They go around excluding people, and they have often very high verbal skills, and they're ruthless. And that's what they do. They don't properly grow up. They go from high school to the pulpit of a newspaper column, and then they go and call out anyone who has a sensible idea about anything. And that's what we've got in Scandinavia. We've got these Me Too type generation with their lipstick and their extremely ignorant and self-assured opinions about NATO and Russia. And I fear that that's what's happened, is that they drown out, 5 or 6 commentators in each country drown out any rational debate about where Sweden's self-interest really ought to be. So there's no debate about NATO or Russia in Scandinavia at all, apart from Tuomas, who I think he knows quite a lot of people in the Finnish elite. He knows the foreign minister, Valtonen, and he says he knows her since way back, and he says, "Come off it." And she says she's an idiot. Anyway, I think let's wind up here, and
Sure.
do so. We're just teeing up the interview that'll be out tomorrow, and good chat, Marty. See you later.
Always a pleasure, Pele. But let's hear it for UKK. Let's have a Kekkonen society to liberate and save Scandinavia.
That's right. So, are you happy with that now? Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll try and put this out a couple of hours after the George interview. It's interesting. Hungary and Finnish are both Finno-Ugric countries. I don't have the.
No, you're right. And by the way, just for future reference, Ireland is an interesting example and counterpoint too, because after 100 years of independence, including 50 years in the EU of prosperity, while staying out of NATO perfectly happily at the same time, there's a movement Finian briefed me on. I mean, Ireland's plunging into NATO madness as well. Even we are.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also. I mean, it's a power thing. The deep state
Yes.
hadn't had this much power, and they see one country after the other. Uh, so this NATOification and militarization is power to them. So that's also another threat to our democracy, which almost no one talks about. And British imperialists, I mean, they're getting Ireland under their wing. I think British imperialists, as it were, imperial instinct. Well, I mean, it's not literally. It's going to be cabinet secretaries and the like. They can say, well, Scandinavia's fallen into our laps. The entire
Oh,
elite in
yeah.
Scandinavia uh, follows us, looks up to us, goes to military meetings in London, and they would never have, I could say that they would never have done that 20, 30, 40 years ago, but now
No.
they do. They're complete slaves, and they think Churchill is the best leader, and they're really pro-British, and they've lost without a shot being fired. Anyway, all right. So, okay, I'll see you tomorrow then, Marty. Okay, bye.
A pleasure. And
All right.
you must let me have a go at blasting Churchill as well, demolishing the idol
Oh yeah,
at some
yeah.
point.